Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. Now, I'm delighted to be joined by a very dear friend of mine, Dr. Rachel Morris, who I was very fortunate to start collaborating with a couple of years ago in a local to where we are in Wales, citizen journalism project, Bylines Cymru, which was a kind of an attempt to give um, to give marginalized voices or voices you rarely hear and opinions and perspectives you rarely hear in kind of mainstream media an opportunity to talk about the really pressing things that are happening in society. So firstly, Rachel, welcome. It's so great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me and making this my first ever podcast guest experience. I'm really delighted that it's with you.
So here we are here to talk today about austerity. Rachel has created an anthology of writing from Byline Cymru, which you can download for free in the notes underneath the podcast. If you scroll down or what have you, you'll find it there. And we began really writing about, and Rachel and I have collaborated on a number of things, writing about the impact of austerity in Great Britain. This is a history podcast, and of course, I talk about modern history, the 20th century, everything from kind of Mao's Cultural Revolution to the Battle of Britain. But if you look at what has happened in Great Britain in the last 15 to 16 years, it is almost without parallel. I cannot think of a peacetime disaster or even a wartime disaster that comes close to what austerity has done to Great Britain. Anyway, I'm going to open the floor to Rachel, and you can tell us your thoughts and views.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned the war because, as I say in my foreword to this book, as far as we know, and it's really hard to tell because austerity started, it was introduced by David Cameron and George Osborne and coalition government, to their shame, the Lib Dems as well, in 2010. But after about 2019, it's really, really hard to work out its impacts because then we start getting into Brexit and COVID as well, and it's difficult to unpick. But the research suggests that it's quite possible that as many as, well, more than twice as many people as died in World War II, at home and abroad, soldiers fighting and people at home during the Blitz, all of it have been killed by austerity.
Yeah.
And it was a political choice. It was said to be necessary for the economy. It was said to be necessary to reduce the debt and so on and so on, and it never did. No. There were three elements to it. We're gonna reduce the debt and the budget deficit, and we're going to do that by cutting public services. And they only did the third one.
Yeah.
And as you know, public services are now on their knees. Many local authorities are on their knees. And one thing that makes me really angry is for decades since Thatcher, there's been this endless privatization of things that used to be public. And I see that as a form of theft.
Yes.
Because those things were our investments. We invested in them. Our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents invested in these things since the dawn of the welfare state, and whenever things like gas and telecom were public assets. So they paid into them. They're supposed to also be, something inherited from us by the next generations. And yet they were privatized. They were sold off, and only people who could afford it, if they were invited to, could invest in those things once they became private. And the rest of us got nothing.
Yeah.
So, and it was really there was never really a mandate for it. It was done without consent, without compensation. And it was literally daylight robbery, and it's still going on. And austerity is another form of that, because local authorities in particular are having to sell off so many of their assets to keep going financially and at least keep meeting their duties under statutes, if nothing more. And again, those things they're selling off, buildings, treasures, resources, those were ours. We paid into that through our council tax, and now they're gone. And I don't know if you know of Leo Szilard. He was involved in the nuclear age. He was a scientist, and so horrified by it that he wrote his own commandments. And I can never remember most of them, but one of them is do not destroy what you cannot create.
Right.
And I keep thinking of that over and over again when it comes to austerity, because that's exactly what it's doing.
The thing that I often kind of come back to in my mind is this idea that, I mean, I don't believe in, for a great many instances of our political class, like, sometimes this happens, but a lot of the time, these things are not driven by stupidity. Sometimes, just occasionally, but a lot of the time, it's driven by either short-term political calculation or a longer-term ideological vision about the way things should be. Of course, if you're you've been raised in wealth and privilege, it's very easy to say that the way things should be for the common man is X, Y, and Z, and they need the discipline of the market and a little bit more privation in order to bring a sort of, I mean, and this was a very Thatcher kind of idea about using economic levers and sticks basically to make better sorts of people. Um, by the time you get to Cameron and Osborne, I think it's a lot more sort of cynical, and I think there's no kind of ideological vision in the tank. I think it's about selling off the public sphere to wealthy friends. But I also come back to this idea that the poverty is the point. That's actually what is trying to be achieved, the creation of poverty.
Interesting. The first half, so when Osborne was asked about austerity, and of course everyone involved in making it happen is doing very nicely indeed. There's
Mm.
never been any consequences for anyone involved, despite all of the death and desperation that was brought about, and the state we're in now as a result. It's never really talked about for obvious reasons. I mean, most of the status quo press is in the pockets of exactly those sorts of people. But Osborne was asked, and he said, and I'm paraphrasing, I can't remember the exact adverb, but he said it was basically stupendously politically effective.
Right.
So really not concerned about the impacts on human beings, and they never did an impact assessment. They never bothered to look into what might happen as a result of it. So there's that, and there is disagreement among economists over whether they genuinely believed that they could tackle the debt. But you'll see in the foreword to this book, I quote Amartya Sen saying, everyone knows that austerity doesn't work, and it certainly doesn't bring growth. In fact, if you want growth, you've got to do the opposite of
Yeah.
austerity. It was never going to work. And a lot of economists do genuinely believe that the only purpose really was to asset strip the state, with the secondary purpose of, because they were pretty, austerity was delivered pretty easily on constituencies that tend to vote conservative.
Mm.
There's plenty of research to back that up. And in fact, Dave, you say about ideology. I mean, David Cameron made a lot of noise about the big society.
Mm.
And I, for my sins a few years ago, read Penny Mordaunt MP's terrible book with a foreword by Bill Gates, of all people, because the person she co-wrote it with is a pal of his or something. And it's really a kind of very odd book, but there's a quote in it about basically breaking down the entire welfare state and handing it over to partnerships of charities and corporations. And if you look into David Cameron's Big Society, that's really what he meant by it. And he may even have believed in it, but Osborne never did. He kind of shrugged and said, no, it's really about votes.
Yeah.
But whether or not it was their intention to asset strip the state and get rid of as much of the state as possible, that is what happened.
Yeah.
Whether or not they meant for it to do. And as for the point about poverty, like, why? Why would they want lots more poor people?
Well, I suppose, I mean, if you dig into the kind of the monetarism of the early 80s, there was this idea that it that you create the euphemism was the flexible labor market. If you have unions and they demand, people that demand higher wages, labor markets, they don't sort of function in the interests of employers. That's the bit that's never put in economics textbooks. It's kind of left off the end. They function nice if you're working class. if, and the poverty is a coercive measure. With when you have poor people, that not only are they economically much more pliable, they'll work at any wage rate you give them, but also you get this huge kind of alienation. You get the formation of, say, working class politics and union activity and community and all this kind of stuff. This kind of cohesive sense of working class identity that tends to vote in working class interests and that sort of thing. That can be devastated quite easily by poverty and by debt as well.
Mm-hmm.
And when you hear stories about mums having to turn to prostitution and things like that in order to feed their children during after the two-child benefit cap, which I explain to non-UK listeners in a moment. You can see how any sort of cohesiveness is just absolutely shattered.
Yeah, I mean it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, really, isn't it? You're not going to be able to, I don't know, fight for rights necessarily if you can't even.
Yeah.
If you have to choose between heat and eat.
Absolutely.
Having said that, there were an awful lot of disabled people fighting for their rights outside Westminster yesterday.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure they did. I think they underestimate people drastically. But it breaks my heart because what happened after the war, and particularly what Aneurin Bevan brought about, was remarkable. And the things that my parents grew up with, and I'm nearly 60, so I just about grew up with them. I was in one of the last, I went to university late, but I was the first in my family to go into Cardiff and did law. Just to explain to confused listeners, I grew up in Stockport because my Welsh dad was a BBC cameraman and needed to be near the Manchester studios. So I grew up talking like this, actually, and I still talk like that when I get on the phone with my cousins. But then we moved to Canada when I was 9, and I picked this accent up. But home for me is Llangollen. It's like the only place on earth I feel at home. I feel Welsh to my bones. So I got a grant to go to uni. I still had to work a little bit while I was a student. But I look at these students now. Someone says in this book, in the piece I put first, actually, many Post-it notes gave their lives to determining the order that the pieces would be in this book.
We will remember them.
Well, and the first piece, he talks about going to university, and one of his fellow students had taken a gap year, which is normal and desirable for lots of people, right? She finished school and then she took a gap year and then she went back to uni. But because she waited that year, his fees were £3,000 at that time, and hers were 9.
Yeah.
Just because of that. And that's when he was thinking about austerity at that phase of his life. That's the thing that sprang to mind, is the kind of just randomness of it. And the bill that just went through its second reading in Parliament yesterday, which it's disgusting because it was such a mess. I don't think people even knew what they were voting on by that point. It's going to keep disabled people and long-term sick people in a kind of limbo while more is sorted out. And again, it's that kind of randomness where they said, well, okay, we'll make a concession, and people who are already on these benefits, it's not going to affect them. But people who come on them later, or people who come off them then go back on them, in some conditions do fluctuate. they're going to be on the new system where they get far less support. And it's that kind of it's so cruel.
Yeah.
It's so cruel and inhuman to not consider circumstances. Yeah.
So for those that don't follow UK politics, and you can be forgiven even if you're in the UK for not following the UK politics because it's so dispiriting and bleak. But if you're living anywhere else around the world, you might be forgiven for thinking that the Conservative Party, the party of austerity, is still in power, but it's not. It was defeated last year in one of the biggest electoral routs that the country has ever seen. It was it was such an electoral rout that it might have resulted in the long term annihilation of the Conservative Party. There's potentially that's on the cards in the way that the Liberals died out in the 1920s. So, what gives? Why are we still in this situation? Well, it's because the Labour Party, ever the kind of the faithful bagman to kind of the Tories, there's the odd notable exception where the Labour Party veers to the left and is soundly destroyed by its enemies, is now is essentially the secondary party austerity, which is a really, really scary place for the country to be. There is no let up to this policy.
There really isn't. I want to go back to the birth of this book quickly. So when I was the founding editor of Bylines Cymru in March. I launched it in March 2023, and I'm still thrilled for so many different reasons that yours was one of the 15 pieces I needed ready in order to be able to launch. And it was about destitution in Cardiff, particularly homeless people living in the street who were struggling with addiction.
Yeah.
And really heartrending. And I think the most read piece of all the ones in the launch and continued to be for a long time. And it set the tone. And it really planted that seed of anti-austerity in my head in a way that hadn't been there before.
Oh, good.
And so almost 2 years on, by then we had quite a big stable of writers for Bylines Cymru. And as you said, none of these people are professional journalists. They have all kinds of different backgrounds. Some of them had never written before. So my editorial support included kind of writing coaching and that kind of thing. Some were very confident writers. So a real kind of mix of people, but not, to my mind, still diverse enough. And I was kind of working on that. But I had been trying to build a community around Bylines Cymru for a long time, and it just never really took. And right. I think it's because building it around something amorphous like, oh, why don't you form a community around my publication, isn't really going to work. It's not necessarily something people can feel loyalty to, though they can. And it's also a bit fuzzy. But the second I said, who cares about austerity? Who's really bothered by it, wants to write about it as a collective project?
Mm-hmm.
I started a WhatsApp group and it had 20, 30 members overnight.
Yeah.
Which was a really useful lesson. And the writing that came in, we were just going to dedicate February this year to it. But so much good writing came in, so much of it, and such high quality that even into March, I was still publishing austerity pieces. And I thought it would be quite a different animal if we then took all those articles and put them in one place. And it was something I was going to get around to doing.
Yeah.
Then I resigned as editor-in-chief of Bylines Cymru the end of April. And I'm trying to develop a new model of journalism that is as inclusive, as experimental, as egalitarian, importantly, as possible. And it's centered around Substack. Because the thing about Substack is, so I announced this on Mastodon and immediately got attacked by people who said, oh, Substack, what are you going on there for? Because a few years ago, there was a kerfuffle because Nazis and other undesirable people with undesirable views were publishing on Substack.
Right.
And some people left in protest, And then it all kind of, and they did ban 5 people for kind of being violent with their voices, and then it'll kind of die down. And this is a year or two ago. But if you look at Medium, they publish Nazis. Ghost, they publish Nazis. Beehive, like in this current world, there is no platform that you can go on with some kind of purity test and not use it.
Yeah.
Given the state of things. And also, Substack is not just a newsletter producer. People think it's like MailChimp. It's not. They're always adding features, and it's so much more than that now. And what really makes it work for my idea, which I call hublication, it's a word I made up. I did a search. No one else is really using it, not in this sense. It's not a publication, it's a hublication. So I've started a Substack. I have 5. My 5th one is called Cymru Conversations, but it's a hub. So I don't intend to use it to publish my writing, which is what people usually do with Substacks.
Yeah.
It's a hub for Welsh voices. And what I'm slowly developing is a way to get those people together and discuss things and share ideas. And maybe, oh, I have an idea, but I don't really want to write about it. You can have it, that kind of thing. But also to promote each other and develop, because journalism to me is such another failed model, like government. Status quo media, and I explain this in a short guide that you can find in the same place as the Austerity book. It's a 25-page PDF that explains it all. Explains the need for it. And the main thing for me about status quo media is it's fired at us, news is fired at us. And it's done almost like a dating app. We get a news story and then we swipe, and then there's another one and we swipe. And we consume it individually. There's no community in it. There's no empowerment in it. We don't get to decide what's reported at us, let alone how or when. And we have no involvement in it, but we're expected to consume it. And they even call us audience or eyeballs. It's this very, very passive relationship where we just receive whatever they fire at us into our news maw. And any kind of conversation around it, any kind of civil discourse is reduced at best to moderated comments.
Yeah.
And to me, that is a failed model. Yes. And no wonder people don't trust the news anymore. And they don't trust because it's not authentic and they don't engage with us authentically.
Yes.
So, but what Substack allows is for people to use their own voices, and if they don't feel like writing, they can make an audio file, they can do a podcast, they can do video, they can do live video.
Yeah.
It's all available to them in Substack for free. So money is no object. And by the way, on the topic of money, you mentioned at the beginning that this book is free. It is, but when you go to the website, you will see a note that if you can't afford to pay something, that would be wonderful. It's a pay what you can model, and that will always apply to publication efforts. Pay what you can. Because that way people who can afford to, who believe in something, can support it on behalf of people who can't afford to.
Yeah.
And now, like this Zoom account that I'm speaking to you on, or other kind of incidental expenses of setting this whole thing up are all coming out of my pocket. And I'm 59. Speaking of austerity, my primary source of income, proofreading, was replaced by AI overnight in November 2023. And I've never really been able to replace it. The work I did on Balance Cymru was voluntary.
Yeah.
So at almost 60, I've just gone onto universal credit, onto benefits for the first time in my life ever. I simply couldn't manage without it. And this is another thing that I don't think is being taken on board. This current government is pushing AI.
Yeah.
Now, as an artist and an author, who's at least 8 of my publications that I know of were stolen to train AI, which I'm now competing with.
Thanks for selling your car to Carvana. Here's your check.
Whoa, when did I get here?
What do you mean?
I swear it was just moments ago that I accepted a great offer from Carvana online. I must have time traveled to the future.
It was just moments ago. We do same-day pickup. Here's your check for that great offer.
It is the future.
It's the present and just the convenience of Carvana. Sorry to blow your mind.
It's all good. Happens all the time.
Sell your car the convenient way to
Carvana.
Pickup times may vary and fees may apply.
And it's very bad for the environment. So for the government to leap on board with AI is a problem in itself. And I'm a member of the Society of Authors, and our collective view is that it's theft. It's bad for the environment. And until that's sorted out, we shouldn't be no one should be getting in bed with it the way that the government is. But this is going to happen more and more when more and more work is taken. I know people who are voiceover artists, copy editors, all kinds of people's work is already being taken by AI, and they're finding it harder and harder to get. So combine that with an austerity landscape, how are people to live? Which is a reason that I'm a UBI cheerleader, but that's another discussion.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm really hoping that this new form of journalism that will allow anybody to take part without gatekeepers, because even with Bylines Cymru, which was citizen journalism, it was still up to me who got published when, how. Substack allows anybody to have a go and have their voices heard. And I think Wales is the perfect place to start something like that. Small country, small population, lots of people with lots to say, but maybe don't usually have a way of saying it because they're locked out of the normal model, and this gives them a way to do it. So this book actually, yes, it collects Bylines Cymru articles, but those people will, some at least, also be involved in Cymru conversations. And so I'm hoping to find funding to do a companion volume and find people, and I've already looked, it's hard to find people who are happy to talk about their lived experience of austerity.
Yeah.
Because there's some of that in this book. It's not all theoretical, and even where it is kind of, head pieces, lots of facts, you can feel the rage underneath that. I would say it's very much a well-balanced head and heart book nonetheless. I really want to know people's lived experience, and that is all the reports on austerity in Wales.
Yeah.
They're quantitative. They haven't gotten people's stories, and I think that's I think that's one reason it's not in the news. People aren't. There is a museum of austerity, which is actually a mobile multimedia museum piece that is being hosted in different places around the country. And I think that's wonderful. And that's a really good way to do it. And I'd like to try something similar for Wales, maybe, because these stories, it's all about stories not being told and not being heard. All of it.
And where we are, some of the people listening to this podcast today will never have been to Wales. They will be. There's a large number of listeners in America, but wherever people are listening, austerity has visited them. Austerity has happened after 2008 in most first world countries.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that always inspires me about people, I think is wonderful about people, is solidarity and the ability for people on the other side of the world to identify with what's happening in a poor part of the Welsh Valleys, or people in the Welsh Valleys to be able to identify with what's happening in Pittsburgh or Ohio, or depressed parts of Canada or Australia. And that to me is just wonderful. That's people at their very best. And, I'd be fascinated to hear if anyone's listening here who, is in a different part of the world, but identifies with what we're talking about here, to get in touch and hear what their austerity stories are like where they live. Different, but the same,
That's a really good point, because I did fear that people might be put off from getting a book that's got Wales on the cover and thinking, oh, well, that's nothing to do with me. But you're absolutely right. It does touch on Scotland and also on Portugal, and a little bit on Greece. But it is, yes, a global experience. And I'm struck, actually, speaking of America and looking at what's happening there at the moment, and this so-called big, beautiful bill that just got passed. Some of the language that's being used to talk about what's being taken away from people is horribly reminiscent of the language around austerity. Because ultimately, it's the same process. It's the very opposite of trickle-down economics. What's the opposite of trickle? Flood, I guess.
Yeah.
It's flood up economics, not trickle down.
Yeah.
And people keep saying, and I'd like to have a webinar with a bunch of economists, actually. I'm really, really going to try and make this happen, where they can argue all they like about why austerity happened. But what I really want to ask them is, where's all the money gone? Because we're all, and this is global, we are all getting ever less, but costing ever more, and it is ever worse.
Yeah.
You just have to look at something like a chocolate bar that is umpteen times more than it used to cost, but is also smaller. And it's just not as delicious as it used to be. I mean, that's a really facile example, but it makes the point.
But
and this is something that a dynamic that is happening all over the world. And it's really at the root of austerity, I think. And we're expected to take it.
Yeah. We must finish there in a moment, but I wonder if there's a further conversation to be had. I have all sorts of fascinating ideas in my mind about comparisons between austerity and 17th century enclosure, which I'll tell you about another time. But yeah, it would be great to continue this conversation in the future, because again, it's that we barely scratched the surface. But anyway, nano plug for the book. It is, as I said, the link is available below. It is pay as you can, shall we say, and the book is Leveling Down, and it's an anthology of bylands Cymru writing. And Rachel, it was just wonderful to have you today.
Wonderful to be had here. Thank you so much for making my first ever podcast so easy. And I agree. And the enclosure comparison is one many have made and is definitely worth further exploration.
I'll write an article on it. Okay.
I look forward to working with you more and to listening to this. And hi, and thank you to everyone who listened.
Thanks so much.